And that allows me to introduce my friend Ann Castle. She's graciously serving as a senior fellow at the center. She'll be moderating several sessions over the next couple of days, beginning with universal access to clean water on tribal lands. Her very impressive bio is in our program, but briefly I wanted to mention just a couple of things. Over 2+ decades of practicing water law, largely at Holland and Hart. Ann served as the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at Interior, where among many important initiatives, she spearheaded the Water Smart program and was the driving force behind the 2010 federal MOU addressing sustainable hydropower. She's provided hands-on leadership on numerous Colorado River issues, including the Water and Tribes Initiative that we'll hear about. She was the champion of Minute 319, a water sharing agreement between Mexico and the United States that we'll also hear more about tomorrow. I really want to mention that you heard about, Doug Kenny has been organizing this conference. Well, in his absence, I reached out to Ann, and from very early on, she stepped up and really helped form the very heart of this conference. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and please help me welcome Ann Castle.
Well, thank you, Alice. I'm so delighted to be able to open this conference this morning with a session on universal access to clean water for tribal communities, because there really couldn't be a more foundational issue than ensuring that all United States residents have access to clean water. And we're so lucky and privileged to have advice and counsel from John Echohawk on these issues and all the incredible knowledge and relationships that he brings to these issues. It's also really nice to see people in person. I'm just so happy to be able to see people. And for those of you who are on the virtual version of this conference, hopefully we'll be able to get together in person soon. So we're going to have a panel, and let me introduce my colleague, Heather Tanana, who is going to be part of this panel. Heather is a professor of law at the University of Utah Law School, also on faculty for the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health. She is a member of the Navajo Nation. There couldn't be a more perfect person to be working with us on this universal access initiative, and Heather leads our research team. We'll also be hearing from Bidtah Becker, who will be appearing virtually. Bidtah has devoted her entire career to service to her Navajo Nation. She's currently an associate attorney with, there she is, with the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. And she and I have been working together over the past year and a half on this universal access initiative. So we're going to hear from all of us. I'm going to talk to you a little bit first to provide kind of an overview and introduction. And this initiative started through the Colorado River Water and Tribes Initiative, and I want to tell you a little bit about that group. This is a project that has been in existence for about 4 years, and it was brought together as a coalition of tribal participation and NGO and other interested party participation to help to elevate tribal voices in connection with discussions and negotiations around Colorado River management. As John said, tribes have not historically been included in those discussions, and the Water and Tribes Initiative was set up to provide a focal point for those tribal interests and to ensure that their interests were considered, their voices were heard in these negotiations. So as part of the Water and Tribes Initiative discussions about a year and a half ago, so summer of 2020, when COVID was surging all over the country, we were seeing a lot of press attention to the disproportionate incidence of COVID on reservations. A lot of attention to the Navajo reservation, but it was a broader problem on reservations around the country. And this group thought that it was a good time, a good opportunity to bring attention to the problem. The press attention has waned, but the problem has not. COVID incidence is much higher on Native American reservations, and Native Americans have the highest hospitalization and death rates of any ethnic group in the country. The CDC keeps statistics on this. You can go to their website and see them, and they do it by race and ethnicity. Native Americans have the highest death and hospitalization rate. And this chart at the top is one that was in the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago. And the folks at the Washington Post have kind of parsed the CDC numbers down to a finer scale. And they found that particularly with younger Native Americans, the age group between 18 and 39 years old, the death rate in that group is 9 times higher than the white population. So this is really, really difficult, really tragic disparities. And since the original surge in COVID, there's been academic work that has found a correlation between the higher incidence of COVID on reservations and the lack of access to clean water. And it's kind of a common sense conclusion, because if you don't have clean running water in your home, you can't, or it's very difficult to follow the hygiene recommendations from the CDC and public health authorities. And you probably also have to go to a community water gathering point to fill up your tanks, and that exposes you to all the people who are also at that watering station, and you have that additional exposure. You may have multi-generational households with people coming in and out. There's a lot of reasons that that we're seeing this higher incidence, but there is a correlation to lack of access to clean water. And when you drill down into that, we find even more horrifying statistics that, as John mentioned, Native American households are far, far more likely to lack this access to safe and clean drinking water. 19 times higher than in the white population. Nearly half of tribal homes don't have access, either access to water or complete indoor plumbing, complete sanitation. And tragically, we find that race is the strongest predictor of lack of access to clean water. It's not rural location, it's not income level, it's race. And I was just reading another study that came out just earlier this week from the Plumbing Poverty Project that is looking at lack of access to clean drinking water in cities. And they also find that race is the strongest predictor there. So these are problems that exist all over the United States. And you'll be hearing later this morning about some specifics from President Nez of the Navajo Nation, from Lorelei Cloud of the Southern Ute Tribe, about what this lack of access looks like and what it means in their particular communities. So all of that is what has prompted this initiative on universal access to clean water. This is our website. There's a lot of information there. And now you'll be hearing from Bidtah and first from Heather about the various components of this initiative, what we've been doing and what we're trying to accomplish. So let me turn it over to Heather.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So before we dive into the specifics of water insecurity, water access in tribal communities, I always like to gauge my audience basic knowledge of tribes. So how, and I'll give you multiple choice, won't make this too hard this morning, but how does the United States Declaration of Independence refer to American Indians? Is it A, they're not mentioned? Is it B, merciless Indian savages? C, native inhabitants of this land? Or D, tribal sovereigns? Let's just leave that a second. A, not mentioned, it's B, right? So merciless Indian savages. So just let that sink in. Here's such an important document in our country's history. And that right from the get-go is how we're referring to tribal nations, Native Americans in this country. Okay, number 2, how many federally recognized tribes are in the US today? Is it A, 2001, B, 1,033, C, 150, or D, 574? Give you a second to think about that. Please note, I said federally recognized. We do have some state recognized tribes, not here in Colorado, but elsewhere in the country. So A, anyone for 2001? B, 1,033, C, 150. So hopefully D was the winner, 574, and there are still tribes that continue to petition the federal government for recognition. All right, our third question, how many of those are here in the Colorado River Basin? A, 29, B, 10, C, 6, or D, 30? So any A, 29s, okay, D, 10, or sorry, B, 10, C, 6. Okay, it's actually 30. I know they're saying, Heather, I've read so many reports, it's 29. No, it's 30 because San Juan, Southern Paiute always gets left off that list. They do not have their own land, their own reservation. Today, it's a long history about that you can read into. They entered into a treaty with Navajo. They should be getting land. They're waiting for Congress to approve it, right? But they are a federally recognized tribe, and they are in the Colorado River Basin. So we do have 30. All right, what about here, last question, in Colorado? How many of those 30 are in Colorado? We've got A, 0, B, 2, C, 8, or D, 4. So anyone think 0? Okay, yeah, we've got 2. So bonus point if you knew who those were. It's our Ute Mountain Ute and our Southern Ute Indian tribe. So as you can see, it's, anytime I do presentations, I've never had an audience get 100% of the questions right. So as a general society, we have much to learn. And that's really what I'm going to take just a couple minutes here doing, because what John and Ann have said is the history is so important. Why do we have Americans that cannot turn on a faucet? Why do we have Americans when we're sending people to the moon and to Mars and we have such, technological advancements? Why can we still not provide clean, safe drinking water to all citizens? Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why these communities lack infrastructure that so many of us take for advantage. And it's the past. It's these federal Indian policies that have crippled tribal communities and that we're still healing from today. And just looking at this timeline here that identifies the different federal Indian policy eras, it's presented in a non-native white narrative. Right from the beginning with our doctrine of discovery, right, our classic Marshall trilogy, where in 3 cases, the US Supreme Court set out the relationship between tribes and the federal government, calling them domestic dependent nations. They have some sovereignty, yes, but they're still reliant on the federal government for protection. That whole premise was based upon international law, right? That was giving the right of a foreign nation to come in and discover and take the land, even though it was already inhabited. Those lands weren't discovered, right? They were colonized, taken away from the indigenous population, and the eras that followed continued to take away from tribal communities, removing them from their homeland and placing them onto reservations, For some, like the Navajo, we were lucky to ultimately have our home ancestral lands. Other tribes were not as lucky, and they were removed far away from lands that had deep spiritual and cultural connection to. And a lot of times these eras, they were done with good intentions. And I'm tearing up because I know where I'm going to go next, right? They were, we're going to assimilate the Native people into our society. To be successful, they need to be like the white man, become farmers, adopt Christian principles, right? In theory, those were good intentions, but the way that the government went about it, without tribal input, without asking the people, what do you need? How can we solve what we view as might be challenges? It left long-lasting historical trauma that continues to be felt today by Native Americans. Again, the forced relocations. But many people don't know that Native women were sterilized without their knowledge or consent. As part of the treaty rights and responsibilities, the federal government has established the Indian Health Service to provide healthcare services to Native people across the country. Women were going in to have their babies or for other reasons, and they were turned barren without knowing. That is a direct strike against our ability to survive as communities. The energy development in this country, it's wonderful that our tribal lands are so rich in resources, but often the benefits of that development were taken away for off-reservation to electrify cities far away when the environmental degradation was left there for the community to bear alone. We have Navajo babies being born right now with traces of uranium in their blood. And the one that always impacts me the most today and is so relevant, today is September 30th. In Canada, it's the first time it's being declared and recognized as the Truth and Reconciliation Day. Here in the US, we have not formally recognized it, but you may still see on social media or out when you're about someone wearing the color orange. It's Orange Shirt Day in recognition of the survivors of the boarding school era. So again, the federal government came into communities, wanted to educate the people. How did they do it? They stole the children. And my own dad was a victim of that, and my grandmother. And that's who's pictured in these photos. My dad on the far left with his siblings in the background, my grandmother in the middle. And I'm here today because he survived. And on occasion over the years, he's told us some of the stories from the boarding school eras. And I always get emotional because I'm sure like anyone's family, when your family member hurts, you hurt, right? He was beaten. He was punished for speaking Navajo. He didn't know when he would see his family again. My grandmother didn't know if she would ever see her son again. And many parents never did. This is what's been highlighted in the news, the hundreds of burial cemeteries that are being found with children that never made it home. My dad was one of the lucky ones. And that picture on the far right there, well, I guess, where you're far right, is of him and his scrubs and me on his shoulders when I was probably only 2. And by American standards, he was successful. He became a physician. He was one of the first in his family to go to college. He was American Indian Physician of the Year. He dedicated his career to the health of Native people. What a success story. And I always hear this question, Heather, well, wasn't the boarding experience good for him? Look at all that he did. And my response hasn't changed over the years. Couldn't we have done it in a better way without the resulting harm? Couldn't the federal government have went into these communities and talked with the people about education and how they could have worked together? Because I guarantee you there was a way that my father could have been successful without those lingering harms. And it's the same, that importance of history of actions being implemented by the government without community input, whether for their good or not. We have that same history when we look at water. Our tribal leaders have been recognizing for decades the importance of water, that there's a federal treaty and trust responsibility related to providing water, and that it is necessary for the survival of our communities. And so that's where I'm going to turn it over to Bidtah to go through that history.
And good morning, everybody. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. I had to stay home because we are in the process of deploying hundreds of millions of dollars to help address this issue. And what I mean by that is it's American Rescue Plan funding. The federal Congress determined that tribes needed to obtain direct funding through the American Rescue Plan to address COVID-related needs on their homelands. And the Navajo Nation has received just over $2 billion. And we need to start deploying that money. So it's exciting to be home, to be working on this. And I want to thank Heather for her honesty and her transparency. These are tough issues. And I just want to highlight that it's my personal belief that we would not be speaking about these issues today were it not for COVID-19. And I think that we are in a transitional point in this country where equity is at the forefront of all of our conversations. And I was on a panel yesterday with John Fleck, who I think is in the audience today, and we were reporting on drought issues. But as John said, we shouldn't use the term drought. So I'm going to use the term water supply issues and the challenges that are facing the Southwest. And David Hayes was on the panel, and he started his comments talking about how we work in siloed worlds, and these silos is part of what's created the challenges that we face today. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But that's one of the reasons why the Biden administration is taking a whole government approach. So I asked Heather to throw together this slide because I think it's an interesting slide. And if we were more technologically sophisticated, we would be able to flip back and forth from the timeline that Heather showed you and this timeline, so if we think about these key pivotal cases that I know everybody in this audience knows, but you think about these cases against the timeline that Heather showed about U.S. Indian policy, I think these cases start to take on in perhaps a different flavor, or it may look different to members of our audience. So again, I won't go through them because this is all of you are water experts, and you know what these cases say. But the point is that we need to move away from the siloed world of waters over here and Indian issues over here, and move to the world of equity. Next slide. So on this, one of the motivating, or one of the messages that we're trying to share in the universal access to clean drinking water effort is that water settlements cannot be a precondition to the delivery of clean drinking water to reservations. And that's not to say that tribal water settlements are not critical. They are incredibly critical. It's that water settlements, as the next bullet says, are complicated. They take decades. And as this audience knows, it involves a much bigger water conversation than clean drinking water to homes. It's about ag water and industrial water. Our effort is focused on clean drinking water to homes. And again, we would not be having this conversation were it not for COVID. But as Anne said, this is not a new problem. And as Heather said, the problem we're trying to highlight and solve in this moment of time, in seizing this moment, is the lack of access to clean drinking water at home. So we're still pulling together numbers right now at Navajo, but there are 3 different groups reaching out, getting names, figuring out where we can deploy resources immediately. And right now, I think we have over 3,500 names of families who need a bathroom addition. Now, that's just one subset of the water supply problem to clean drinking homes. But these are people who have been identified who live in homes that do not have the physical bathroom structure, right? So they fit into a different category. It's in addition to getting them a water line or a cistern, we have to get the funding to build that bathroom addition. And so that's what I was working on yesterday and why I couldn't be with you today. So let me turn it back to Heather to talk about the wonderful research that she led that really spurred on our effort.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll talk specifically about our project. And again, something I think we've all have been incredibly invested in over the past year. And initially, we were really trying to understand the problems, particularly what does lack of water mean for tribes in the Colorado River Basin. And what we found is that lack of access could take different forms. No tribe is the same. They're all going to have their own reservation area or history, but we're very confident, and our research has shown that every tribe in the basin and broadly across the US is dealing with one of these challenges. And the first one is one that we've talked about already. It's a lack of piped water service into homes. As mentioned, Native American households are less likely than any other group to lack piped water service into their homes. And Navajo Nation in particular, their challenges were really highlighted by the media over COVID. What Bidtah just talked about, it's estimated up to 40% of Navajo Nation homes lack water. I was just visiting my cousin outside of Gallup and Rehoboth the other weekend. She was fortunate to get electricity in, but said they were told it would take another year to get water in. Can you imagine, my kids are asking, where do I go to the bathroom? Go to the outhouse, right? That's their standard of living right now, which is very different from mine in Salt Lake City. The second challenge that tribal communities are facing is their water quality. It's inadequate or just unacceptable. In some cases, the water quality is presenting a health risk, right? Hopi in particular, they estimate that 75% of people living on their lands are drinking naturally occurring arsenic contaminated water. And again, that's not limited to Hopi. There's just a study done at the beginning of this year looking at the Crow Reservation, and 39% of the tribal families were using wells that were unsafe for long-term consumption due to the metal levels or nitrates, but they had no other option. And so they continued to use that contaminated water. Again, broadly, there's another study that found that 61% of drinking water systems on reservations had health or other significant violations, compared to just 27% of all public systems in the US. The third challenge is that even if you have a water line coming in, maybe the quality is meeting APA or other standards for now, but it's just not adequate for the growing population of the tribe, or it's deteriorating and it needs to be replaced. So our infrastructure investments are not keeping up with need. And this is a problem across the US for sure, not just tribal nations, but tribes in particular have been struggling with this. Colorado River Indian tribes has systems dating back to the late 1800s. And we know that investments in our infrastructure provides a lot of economic returns. So the US Water Alliance says every dollar spent on water infrastructure improvements generates $6 in return. Indian Health Service tells us that every dollar spent on sanitation facilities in tribal areas has at least a 20-fold return in health benefits. And then our fourth and kind of final category we identified is operation and maintenance support. Tribes continue to face structural challenges in supporting their O&M. And when you are not maintaining your systems. It's going to put that future continued, provision of water at risk. And this, is another tricky area for tribes because of their revenue streams. So tribes are unable to tax their tribal lands, so they can't use that resource. And so they often have to pull from somewhere else. Some tribes are fortunate to have other economic developments that they can utilize. But remember, these tribes, they're operating everything. They're dealing with not just these water challenges, but the murdered and missing Indigenous women's epidemic that's going on. They're trying to supplement IHS health facilities because IHS is underfunded. There is a lot on their plates. O&M is no exception. So that is the different areas we highlight in our report. Again, the website Ann showed earlier, tribalcleanwater.org, provides the full report and goes into all of these areas in much more detail. But knowing the problem, then what do we do about it? How are we going to solve it? And so Bidtah is going to run through the commitment from the federal government, funding, and our proposed whole of government approach.
Thanks, Heather. So this is for me, the exciting and optimistic part of the presentation. I do want to take a step back, because I don't think Ann, Ann mentioned that she and I have been working on this project for 1.5 years. When COVID started, both Ann and I were hearing from various people about how surprised they were about the lack of access to clean drinking water in Indian country. And it was particularly interesting to me because, as Ann said, I spent my whole career working on this. And there were friends and colleagues in the Colorado River Basin who were also reaching out. And I thought that was really interesting because, Navajo had entered into its San Juan River settlement. The Utah settlement had been worked on for years, and somebody's asked a question about that I can address in a minute. And I thought we had always been very clear that the key to those projects, so settlements, were clean drinking water projects. And so it was interesting to me, it's something about human psychology, right? That it took that knowing somebody who was affected or potentially affected by the lack of access to clean drinking water really seemed to open people's eyes to the problem. So Ann and I seized the moment, as the earlier slide said, and we had no idea what we were entering into. When we started this, we thought we were going to do some educational work, but we were pushed very early on to go to do much more than education. That many people saw what was happening. I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but President Obama's chief of staff is famous for saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." So that's what we're doing. This is a good crisis that we will not let go to waste. And these are the 3 prongs of our effort. Next slide, they fit very nicely into the Biden, what the Biden administration has identified as their priorities: COVID, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. And climate change may not seem like a specific fit with universal access to clean drinking water, but as we're dealing with water supply challenges in the Southwest, we know that building resilient water systems is part of addressing climate change. I'm happy to report that the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, which was the centerpiece of the Navajo Nation's San Juan River settlement, it started delivering water in one of 2 laterals. There are 2 laterals. If you know New Mexico, one goes down 550 and the other will be constructed along 491. 550 is Farmington to Cuba, New Mexico, and then 491 is Shiprock down to Gallup. But the 550 lateral started delivering water last October. Right, the timing couldn't have been better. But Navajo Gallup, the reason I'm focusing on Navajo Gallup is it is truly a drought response project, because it's taking available San Juan River surface water supplies and moving it through the Navajo Nation. The the groundwater supplies are very challenged. So very much a resilient project that will support the Navajo Nation for many decades to come. So nice alignment between universal access and those priorities. So an area that we did not know last June when we started this project that we'd be entering into is really delving into the details of what funding is needed. And if the person controlling the slide could toggle to the next slide and then go back to this slide. The reason I'm doing this is I just wanted to show the audience all the agencies that have some role in getting clean drinking water to Native people. So if you jump back to the first funding slide, Indian Health Service is responsible for what's called sanitation facilities. And this is interesting because as we've gone through this journey, it's not readily apparent to people that sanitation facilities is the same thing as clean drinking water. But that's essentially, it's one and the same. Sanitation facilities deals with both clean drinking water to the home and then dealing with the wastewater as it comes out. IHS has publicly reported that they have an existing, and I think this is very interesting. You know, the United States has a known list of sanitation deficiencies in this country, and has had that list arguably since 1959 when this program was created. IHS has reported that sanitation deficiencies list numbers actually, this says $3.4 billion. Well, what IHS has reported is that they have 3.2 billion. Working with Senator Bennett, who is a key sponsor of this bill, our team suggested putting together funding in the amounts that you see here. One, to address the existing lack of infrastructure, but then two, to address the issues that Heather mentioned, which is operation and maintenance. These systems are only as good as long as they last. So that's a big ticket item. And I won't walk through the rest of them because I think we're starting to run out of time. But you see them listed here. EPA plays a role in this, USDA rural development. Some people were not aware that some tribes' systems have been built through USDA rural development. Reclamation has a role both in their technical assistance program and through the Rural Water Supply Act Authority. Next slide. This is what came out in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So this was an amazing day when we learned, go back to that slide, when we learned that the Senate had come to agree on $3.5 billion for IHS, more than we had even identified. It just confirmed the notion that there is a consensus in this country that this issue needs to be resolved. And the Infrastructure Investment Act has this level of funding for EPA and reclamation. What it lacks, next slide, what the bipartisan infrastructure bill lacks is funding for USDA, funding for some additional funding for reclamation. But most importantly, it's that O&M assistance. And what I think is most interesting here is that when Congress created this program, the Indian Health Service Sanitation Deficiency Program, they authorized IHS, Congress authorized IHS to support tribal O&M, but Congress has never funded that. That sentence alone has stopped many congressional staffers in their seat, in their step. And they've all said, you just keep repeating that sentence, that Congress authorized this but has never funded it. Next slide. So as we mentioned, we're advocating for a whole of government approach. We have, through Heather's leadership, developed what we're calling an administrative reform report that Ann and I and Heather will be emailing out a draft. We'll be emailing out a draft of this administrative reform report to many people, hopefully some of you in the audience. And what we're doing in that report is identifying how the federal government can take a whole of government approach in this universal access to clean drinking water. You've seen the number of agencies that have a role in clean drinking water in Indian country. We know the Biden administration supports whole of government for climate change issues as reflected in Executive Order 14,008. So we're just building on the already wonderful ideas that are coming out of the Biden administration and helping folks, helping, hopefully we're helping. We feel like we're helping and not being officious intermeddlers, but helping the federal government transition to this world of funding. And I'm living this as we speak, right? Those of us who've been doing this work we're most accustomed to living in a world of very little resources. Now we have the resources we need. And so our systems have got to quickly adjust to move to that new world. And of course, in any whole of government approach, we're going to have to not only capitalize on the strengths of the agencies, but always remember to consult with tribes. Because as Daryl V. Hill says, when you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And I like to say, when you know, and with Navajo, you don't even know one tribe, right? We're so big, you really have to learn the local customs all throughout the reservation. And hopefully a few of you in the audience are chuckling about that because you worked with Navajo and you know what it's like. Next slide. So just another slide. I think really the point of that slide is that picture that was drawn 20 years ago to take to a congressional hearing on why we need the San Juan settlement passed. So I love this picture because depending on who the audience is, everybody sees something different. Like you all might have noticed the fresh instead of the fresh, but when I show this to a Navajo audience, what they all chuckle about is it's a Ford and not a Chevy. But this is right. But this is I think a fourth grader, maybe a second grader's view of where fresh water comes from, right? And what's interesting is those are metal barrels. I think today, if that were drawn, it would probably be a larger plastic barrel. But the Ford is just classic, right? Today it'd be a much bigger truck. This is John talked about this yesterday, that we have to have optimism. I think just in this half-hour presentation, we've shown how much the United States has progressed when it comes to Indian issues. Solving this issue right now I'm tearing up, will really change the game, for Native people. And I have to thank Heather for tearing up, because before Heather, I was only the only person crying, and now I have sisters in the fight who have lived this experience and who understand how important it is. So last slide, here's our contact info. We are always looking for people to join our effort to advocate with us. And I will end there. And hopefully we have time for questions. If not, I apologize for going over.
No, thank you. Thanks to both Heather and Bidtah. And obviously you can tell we're all so passionate about this initiative. And I so appreciate all the soul that both Bidtah and Heather have put into this work. So we have time for a couple of questions. I don't know if we have questions in the chat, but certainly we can take questions from this audience here.
And we did have a question in the chat from Terry Fisk asking, does the recent settlement agreement between Navajo and the state of Utah help remedy these problems? And the answer is yes. I'm embarrassed that I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. What I would, so the little bit of difference between what we're doing and, for instance, what the settlement agreement does is we're really focused on getting the existing federal agencies with existing authorities fully funded to deploy immediately. The Utah settlement agreement, much like the Navajo San Juan settlement agreement, addresses the bigger water supply projects, and they will address part of the problem. But right now, we're very much focused on deploy, get water to Heather's cousin, get water to, people immediately, so that we can get through COVID, right? So that we can successfully get through the pandemic we're in.
Yeah, thank you, Bidtah. Questions? Comments? Yes, go ahead.
I'll wait, I'll just the microphone. I really enjoyed your presentation. I liked it a lot. I see that you guys have like a huge undertaking. So what are your steps moving forward? Are you going to be contacting individual tribes, seeing if they, are interested in your help, have drinking water issues? Have you identified where to go next after Navajo? Things along those lines, so.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take a crack at that and then invite Heather and Bidtah to chime in. This is really a nationwide initiative. Both Heather and Bidtah have their roots in the Navajo Nation, but it has never been a project limited to Navajo. And even though the solutions are site-specific and unique, okay. Some of the underlying issues are universal, and that's certainly true with the history that both Heather and Bidtah have recounted. But it's also true in connection with the federal agencies that have programs that are aimed at solving at least a portion of this problem, in that all of those programs have been historically underfunded and badly underfunded. And so understandably, the agencies have kind of drawn circles around what they're going to fund and what they're not going to fund because they were so limited. If these infrastructure bills pass and the Build Back Better bill passes, funding will not be the limiting factor any longer. And so the regulations, the guidelines, the restrictions, the way applications are considered, that needs to evolve into a full funding environment. And those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, that the research team is working on to try to make recommendations about how to adjust to what is hopefully a new environment, a new funding environment, and that is nationwide as well. Consultation with tribes is a given because these issues are unique. Every single tribe has, and may within the tribe have several different kinds of lack of access to clean water. And so the solutions have to be individually crafted as well. Heather, do you want to add?
And I'll just add that when we started the work, I do think we thought that piped water plumbing would be the primary issue. And it was discussions with tribal council, water divisions, with the tribes that we realized it was much broader. And that's what those discussions with tribes in the basin using the Water and Tribe Initiative in their context, that led to formation of those different buckets. And our report goes into much depth on the different programs. We just didn't talk about that in this session because it's going to be addressed later on. But we had a lot of conversations with agency folks and tribal individuals to put together our report.
Bidtah?
I don't think, did we share the statistic on the need at Southern Ute? I think that's an interesting statistic for people.
Yeah.
Where about 13% of their people haul water. So I'm just underscoring the fact that the lack of access takes on 4 forms and affects all tribes.
Absolutely. And Lorelei Cloud is here and going to be speaking in just a few minutes about the Southern Ute issues in particular. We have time for one more question. Anyone? Yes.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring talks. I'm curious about, in this process, is there also integrated education in terms of bringing a lot of the engineering technical capacities for the O&M integrated within the tribal societies itself via the colleges, Dene College or various ones to increase the engineering capacity for the operation and maintenance internally?
Yeah, such a good question, really critical. O&M is not just money to operate systems, but it's also the development of tribal capacity to ensure that those systems keep operated, that they're operated by tribal community members who are knowledgeable and certified. The way that has the way the funding streams work for that is through the Indian Health Service Operation and Maintenance Assistance. Reclamation has authority to provide technical assistance to tribes. And there are, as you alluded to, organizations that do the kind of operator training and certification. ITCA in Arizona does that nationwide, actually, for tribes. There are other tribal organizations that train and certify water and sanitation operators. Those are the kinds of the efforts that we need to engage with and deploy, but it also takes money. So one of the well, I think a couple of the recommendations in the administrative reform report deal with that issue specifically. So hopefully we'll have that out in another couple months. Heather, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really critical. You know, again, it's not just our water field across the board. Outsiders are having to come into the clinics as physicians and engineering, and they're just less likely to stay in those communities. And so I think it's really important that we start building up the capacity within the communities, and that's just going to take some time, right? The junior high student now, the high schooler, getting them to go to college and do an engineering degree. I know in the legal field, we have our own outreach, the med schools do as well, and there's a great the Engineering Society, American Indians of Engineering. They have a society, and I know we're all working to build up tribal communities. And in our report, in the lack of O&Ms being funded, we do have a section highlighting the different technical assistance programs that are there. They help a little bit. There's circuit riders with different agencies that will go out. It helps a little more as needed, and we do make some recommendations of how to do that.
And let me just close this session by saying that this is a problem whose time has come. There is widespread recognition of these types of racial justice equity issues. And Boulder's own Congressman Joe Neguse and Senator Michael Bennet have both introduced resolutions with some of their colleagues in the House and the Senate in support of universal clean water access for tribes. And those resolutions have received widespread support from the water community, from the Colorado Water Congress, from the U.S. Water Alliance, from the National Water Resources Association, through John Echohawk's effort from the National Congress of American Indians. I mean, people know that this is the time to solve the problem. And we have this opportunity now. If we can't do it now, it may be another decade, it may be another generation before we have this window of time again. So thank you all for your attention. We'll be talking more about this issue, and any of us are available to talk more or answer questions. Thanks.
We're going to take a short break, and because of our Zoom appearances, I'm going to be a little rigid about this. I hope you can be back in 10 or 12 minutes, President Nez from the Navajo Nation will be appearing via Zoom at 10:35. So if you could be back in your seats a few minutes before that, that'd be great. There's food and drink over here. Restrooms are at the end of the hall, and I'll see you in about 12 minutes. Thank you.